In everyday life, we often fail to recognize the mysterious forces lurking around us. Yet in this story, a young boy named Kevin uncovers a dark secret that only he can perceive. Everyone has a shadowy presence, a little demon that follows their every step. These demons are not only attached to us but also deeply influence how we live and behave. Kevin, the only one able to see these demons, embarks on a painful and terrifying journey to understand their true nature and confront the unimaginable consequences that follow. Everyone has a demon. Most just aren't aware of it. But I am. I can see them. They perch on your shoulders or ride on your back, whispering into your ear. Sometimes they murmur sweetly and soothingly. Other times their words are bitter and venomous. Some demons are small and almost cute, while others are brutish, foul, and slovenly. The worst are abominations, twisted, malevolent creatures that revel in misery and suffering. You can learn a lot about someone by observing their demon. My demon's name is Jack. At least, that's what I call him. They never reveal their real names, and that's fine by me. Jack suits him perfectly. Jack has been with me as long as I can remember, for my entire life. He was always there. When I was lonely, Jack would play with me. When I was sad, he would crack jokes to make me laugh. When I was bored, he would tell me stories. Jack always knew the right things to say. When I was young, I thought my parents could see him too. They called Jack my imaginary friend, and my mother would proudly tell other moms about her creative son, Kevin, and his vivid imagination. Sometimes they'd ask me questions about Jack, or they'd ask him questions about me. He always answered, but I began to notice something strange. They never seemed to react quite right. It was as if they weren't actually hearing him. They'd become smug and say things like, "I think Jack is telling you to finish your green beans, don't you think, honey?" I thought they were ignoring Jack on purpose, and it frustrated me to the point of tears. I was 9 when I finally figured it out. They really couldn't see him. They were pretending, not me. They were fools. I knew Jack was real as anyone else. So I talked about him all the time. To my parents, my teachers, the kids at school, trying to convince them that Jack was real. That's when it stopped being cute, and my parents began to worry about me. Sometimes at night, I'd lie in bed, listening to my parents talking in the kitchen. My mother would get weepy, and my father would speak in quiet, soothing tones. He'd say things like, "It's just a phase, he'll grow out of it. All kids go through this. It just lasts longer for some." I'd lie in bed with Jack by my side, comforting me. "Why can't they see you?" I'd ask. "You have a gift, a special gift." "They don't," Jack would reply, smiling. "But why don't they believe me? I'm their son. Why do they think I'd lie?" "That's just how people are. You're very young, Kevin. You have so much to learn about the world. But I'll always be here for you, Kevin. You can count on me. I'll always be here for you." Around this time, I started getting into trouble at school. The other kids would make fun of me when I talked about Jack. They called me Crazy Kevin and Baby Boy Kevy Weavy. They'd laugh, throw punches in the air, and pretend they were beating Jack up. They'd taunt me and push me down, and when I tried to defend myself, I was the one who got in trouble. Kids can be so cruel, and the teachers weren't much better. They'd tell me, "Stop talking about your imaginary friend, and the other kids will leave you alone." So I did. I wasn't a dumb kid. I knew they were making fun of me because I was different. They didn't have imaginary friends, and I did. Even though I knew Jack was real, no one else believed it. Imaginary friends weren't supposed to be real. The unknown scared them. I scared them. So I stopped talking about Jack and ignored him, pretending he wasn't real. Jack got angry. Sometimes at night, he'd knock things over or throw objects around my room to get my attention. He'd break things in the house and I'd get blamed. Even worse, he started appearing in my dreams, tying me up and torturing me in strange rituals, chanting and carving symbols into my flesh. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, mind reeling, with Jack hovering above my bed, quietly watching as I slept. Finally, when I couldn't stand the torment anymore, I started talking to him again. Only in whispers and only late at night when the rest of the house was asleep. I explained the situation to him, about my parents, my teachers, the kids at school. When I told him, he smiled. He understood. Jack always understood. He told me that everyone has a demon, just like me. They just can't see it. They don't know it exists. He told me I was special, that I had a gift. I was still doubtful, but Jack wasn't upset. He told me I was so special that he was going to get me another gift, just to prove it. Then he disappeared. For the first time in my life, I was alone. I felt so scared, abandoned, and utterly alone. I was miserable. A week passed and still no Jack. Was this how regular people lived their lives? So lonely all the time. How did they stand it? Then one night I woke up and he was there, standing over my bed as if he had never left. I was so happy. "Where did you go, Jack?" I asked. "To get your gift, of course. But where is it?" "You already have it," Jack answered. "But where? You didn't give me anything." "Shh, quiet child. It will all make sense in the morning. Go to sleep now, Kevin. Go to sleep, child." He sang me a lullaby in some ancient tongue as I drifted off. I woke up the next morning, as excited as a kid on Christmas, ready to run out of my bedroom and see my new gift. But Jack grabbed me by the arm and spoke sternly. "You must promise me, Kevin, whatever you see out there, you must promise never to tell anyone about it. You must never speak of it aloud. Otherwise, your gift will disappear. Otherwise, I will disappear." I promised. "Promise me 3 times, Jack said. So I did. "You've promised me thrice, never to speak of what you see. Do not forget your promise, Kevin." We walked into the kitchen and I stopped dead in my tracks. There at the breakfast table sat my mother and father. On each of their shoulders perched a demon. On my mother's sat a large puffy creature, a mix between a bunny rabbit and a giant marshmallow, but with huge doughy eyes and long silver fangs. On my father's sat a long, skinny, worm-like creature with hollow eyes and the face of a bat. It was blue and translucent like ice, a cloud of steam rising from its body. Its tail was coiled around my father's neck. I yelped in surprise and 8 eyes turned towards me. 4 human, 4 demonic. I made an excuse to my parents, which calmed them down, but the demons stared at me wide-eyed. At first, I thought they were angry, but then I realized they were afraid. Afraid of me, afraid that I could see them. The bat snake hissed something I couldn't understand. But Jack barked back in a gruff, guttural language that echoed in our tiny kitchen. My parents' demons cowered before him, submissively. From that day forward, I saw them everywhere I went. It was scary, but at least I knew I wasn't alone. Everyone has a demon. Still, it could be overwhelming. There were so many, and they all knew that I knew. They would say things to me, horrible things. They would brag about all the twisted and perverted acts they had convinced their people to commit. They would tell me about their people's evil thoughts and dark secrets. The demons delighted in recounting these tales in graphic detail. Sometimes Jack would stop them, but sometimes he wouldn't. Or even worse, he couldn't. Some of them were scarier than Jack, stronger than Jack, and there was nothing he could do. Sometimes I would catch an evil glint in Jack's eyes, and I could tell that he enjoyed hearing about all the wicked and foul deeds other demons had convinced their people to do. He almost seemed jealous. It became too much. I had to make some changes. I started walking to school instead of riding the bus. I avoided crowds and spent my free time alone in my room or out hiking in the woods. But it was no use. I started falling behind in school. It was impossible to concentrate in class with all those demons glaring at me, whispering to me, laughing at me. I told Jack about this, but he shrugged it off. He reminded me that this was a gift, that I was special. He promised that one day I would be glad I had it. I trusted him. Jack was always there for me. Jack always took care of me. Sometimes I felt afraid. I could always tell who the really bad people were by the size and nastiness of their demon. I could see all the liars, the adulterers, the rapists, the murderers, and the child molesters. They walked the streets, mingling in secret with the good people and the normal people, like wolves among sheep, and nobody knew but me. You'd be surprised just how many of them there are, and there was nothing I could do about it, at least not yet. That changed in the 10th grade when I met Elijah. Elijah was a bully, and he didn't try to hide it. He was a fat, ugly, hulking slab of a boy. He was stupid too, book stupid, or willfully ignorant at the very least. But when it came to bullying, he was a genius. He had an uncanny ability to find a person's greatest joy in life and turn it against them. He seemed to make it his personal mission to torment the smaller, smarter, weaker, and more introverted kids, of which I was one. He also had one of the nastiest demons I'd ever seen. It was a massive hippopotamus-looking beast with twisted horns and breath like the grave. It lay across his shoulders, making Elijah slouch when he walked. The popular kids ignored most of us, but they despised Elijah. In his mind, that was our fault, and he made sure that we paid for it. He loved to trip kids in the hallway, knock their books out of their hands, snap girls' bras, fire spitballs in class, and generally make our lives a living hell. Elijah's specialty was stealing lunches, and he did it with aplomb. I never once saw him buy a lunch or bring his own. He'd simply go from table to table, taking what he wanted from the nerds. He always made sure to take my milk. I don't even think he liked it, but he knew that I liked it, so he'd take it, chug it down, and throw the empty carton in my face, laughing all the while. Jack started whispering things to me, telling me what a horrible person Elijah was, telling me all the nasty things he did when he was alone, telling me how he reveled in torturing and killing people's pets out in the woods, telling me about the things he would do to his little sister late at night, telling me all the horrible things he would do in the future, telling me that if Elijah died, no one would miss him. I tried to ignore him, but the longer it went on, the more sense Jack seemed to make. The final straw came one day when Elijah caught me alone in the bathroom. I was standing at the urinal peeing when I heard the door open and heavy footsteps come up from behind. "Oh, look at this. Is Whittle crazy Kevy Wevy having a Whittle pee-pee break?" he sneered. His breath was hot on my neck, like a foul breeze wafting from a garbage dump on a scorching summer day. I ignored him, trying to finish the task at hand as quickly as possible. "What's wrong, faggot? You deaf or something?" he asked. I continued ignoring him. Big mistake. He kicked me hard on the backpack, smashing my chest into the urinal and my face into the concrete wall. I saw stars and fell to the ground, my members still in hand, still urinating. "Oh no, look at that! Whittle Kevy fell down and wet himself. Here, let me help you with that." I lay on the ground in a daze and heard pants unzipping somewhere above me. Then a warm, putrid stream was pouring over my backpack and down my legs, and Elijah was laughing. I covered my head and pretended I was somewhere else. When it was over, I heard the door slam shut, and from the hallway, Elijah yelling, "Hey everybody, check it out! Crazy Kevin pissed himself." I looked up and there was my demon Jack. He was staring at me with a smirk on his face. "Okay, you win. Tell me what I have to do." Jack's smile widened. "Easy," he said. "Switch to almond milk." For the next 2 weeks, I packed my lunch with almond milk instead of my regular 2%. It tasted disgusting, but I hardly ever got to drink it anyways. Elijah stole it from me every single day without fail, and he really seemed to enjoy the taste. Then one day after school, a knock came at my door. It was a stranger, disheveled and wild-eyed, dressed in a cheap suit. His demon was a snake, red as Venus blood, venom dripping from its maw. He didn't say a word, just handed me a crumpled paper bag and walked away. I opened the bag and pulled out a clear vial with a strip of masking tape on the side. On the masking tape, in clear black Sharpie marker, one single word was written: cyanide. Jack was grinning again. "Tastes like almond," he whispered. I mixed it into my milk for tomorrow's lunch, and the next day I ditched the empty vial in a dumpster on my way to school. A few minutes after drinking my milk, Elijah was convulsing on the floor. I sat and watched, casually munching on a taco. A few minutes after that, he was dead. I wasn't sad. I actually felt good. Better than I had in a long time. The cause of death was determined to be cerebral hypoxia, likely brought on by a stroke. Very few mourned his passing. I started missing more and more school, and a few months later, I dropped out completely. Not that I felt guilty or thought I might get caught. No way. I just had other, more important work to do. I got a job in a rough part of the city, working in a crumby old bookbinding factory. The work was monotonous but easy, and I soon saved up enough to buy a used car and rent a shitty studio apartment. I worked second shift at the factory, from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. Most guys hated the hours, but I found them perfect for supporting my extracurricular activities, finding bad people and killing them. My demon helped me. Jack was a real natural when it came to this. He helped me track down people with particularly nasty demons, and he'd tell me all the vile things they had done. We stalked them like hunters, learning their patterns and routines. Then he'd tell me the best way to kill them. Pimps, rapists, drug dealers, child molesters, human traffickers, I did them all. Sometimes I made it look like an accident or a suicide or a robbery gone wrong. I beat, stabbed, strangled, shot, and drowned. I even pushed one fat fucker on the third rail of the subway. He fried just like bacon, even smelled like it. Jack was always there for me, protecting me, making sure I got away with it. The best part was, I never felt bad about it. Every person I killed was a wretched excuse for a human being. They deserved it. I was making the world a better place. Some might even say I was a hero. My conscience was clear. I slept like a baby. Killing people become normal. Fun even. It was my hobby and damn was I good at it. Eventually, I didn't even think about it anymore. I just did it. And that's when it all came unraveled. I was out on patrol one night, following the SUV of a mid-level drug dealer as he made his pickups. He must have made me because as we came to an intersection, he slowed down and waited until the light was just changing from yellow to red, then floored the gas pedal. I tried to follow, but I must have been a second too late because a black BMW going the other way smashed into the side of my car, T-boning me and sending me spinning through the intersection. My head must have slammed into the steering wheel because I briefly lost consciousness. When I came to, my ears were ringing and stars danced before my eyes. Smoke drifted from the front of my car. Then I heard another noise, angry, screaming, and cursing. The owner of the BMW was striding towards me, a mountain of a man, face red, fists clenched, arms swinging, spittle flying from his mouth as he screamed. I lurched from my seat to face him, blood pouring from the gash on my forehead. Straddling the man's shoulders was one of the most horrific demons I had ever seen. It was huge, round, pale white, and bloated like a corpse. Pus oozed from 1,000 sores covering its corpulent body. It had no arms or legs. Instead, its entire mass was one giant face consisting of two tiny, beady black eyes and one enormous, gaping mouth filled with row upon row of razor-sharp teeth. A forked tongue slithered snake-like through its fangs, flitting through the air, searching for a victim. I felt bile rising from my throat and fought it down. As the man surged towards me, I felt my rage rise, and I found myself thinking about Elijah, about all the times he had teased me, tormented me, humiliated me. I thought I heard a subtle whisper in my ear, "Do it." My mind went blank. My vision went white around the edges. I felt like I was trapped behind my eyes watching, unable to control what was happening. The man was close, screaming in my face. He meant to hurt me. I reached into my pocket, then a flash of chrome in the streetlight, a hot torrent spraying me in the face. The man's eyes bulging with rage one moment, now rolling back into his skull, his body slumping to the ground, my knife buried in his throat. I looked to Jack for help, but he was laughing like a madman, and screeching something in that foul, ancient language. Realization set in. I'd done this man, done him out in the open, at a city intersection, under a streetlight, with no planning or forethought, with no escape route and no plan for cleanup. I turned on Jack in a panic. "Are you just going to stand there laughing? Help me! Tell me what to do! How do I fix this?" He was howling now. "This one was all you. I had nothing to do with it. The man you just killed was a politician, a city councilman, perhaps no less of a criminal than the pimps and gangbangers we normally kill. But this guy did it under the guise of law and order. I didn't make you do this. You chose this." I could almost feel my face go white as a ghost, and the world began to spin around me. I was stumbling towards the car, trying not to vomit, when I heard the noise behind me, followed by the scream of a siren. A cascade of red and blue light reflected off the windows of my car and the shops around me. The cruiser peeled out from the gas station across the intersection and rushed towards me. I sat in the interrogation room for hours. Jack stood next to me smirking as the detectives worked me over. It all came out. They found everything. Enough evidence in my car and my apartment to tie me to dozens of murders. They said it would be a miracle if I got life in prison. The DA would go for the death penalty on this one for sure. Then they were laughing, and their demons were laughing, and Jack was laughing too. My court-appointed lawyer was a mousy man with thick glasses and mustard stains on his suit jacket. His demon was a small, skittering cockroach with the sallow face of a dead baby. He did not seem optimistic about my chances. The only hope to avoid the death penalty, he said, was to claim guilty but insane or mentally ill. Have you ever felt like you weren't in control of your actions? Have you ever heard voices in your head telling you to do things? Someone speaking to you? God, the devil, or demons? I pondered that for a moment. Jack was smiling, but his stare was black. "Don't forget your promise," he whispered. "You swore to me. You swore 3 times, never to tell anyone." "I remember," I replied, "but this is no gift. It's a curse, and I'm glad to be through with you." My lawyer looked confused. "Who are you talking to?" "My demon," I said. "Everybody has a demon. Most people just can't see them. My demon is named Jack, and yes, he tells me to do things." Now I'm alone. Jack is gone forever. I sit here in a straitjacket within these 4 padded walls, waiting for my pills, waiting to forget. I'll never see the sunshine again. Everybody has a demon, everybody except me. As we see in Kevin's story, the presence of a demon is not just a supernatural element, but a reflection of the darker aspects within each of us. Kevin discovered that what he believed to be a gift was in fact a horrifying curse, leading him to commit heinous acts and ultimately destroy his own life. This is a crucial lesson about how we confront our inner darkness and how to recognize and control it before it controls us. Have you ever felt that you were being influenced by something within you that you couldn't explain? If so, take a moment to reflect. It might be a sign of things that need to be clarified and managed. Share this story and your thoughts with those around you. Don't let the demons in your life or within you take away your true self. Click like and subscribe to stay tuned for more stories and join us in exploring the mysterious elements of the world around us. In the dim and shattered corners of a crumbling house, where the past lingers like ghosts and broken promises, two sisters grapple with the remnants of their fractured childhood. This is a story of survival, not just against the decaying walls of their home, but against a far more insidious force: addiction. As the house deteriorates, so does their mother, and the sisters are left to piece together a semblance of normalcy amidst the chaos. Tonight we journey into their world, where the echoes of past laughter are overshadowed by the harsh reality of their mother's struggles, and where the boundaries between love and fear become dangerously blurred. Addiction gradually consumed our mother, cradling her in its grasp and lulling her to sleep, sinking deeply into the mattress on her bed. When her back teeth fell out, she left them beside the bathtub. I was 7 at the time and kept them in a matchbox, preserving the missing pieces of her so she wouldn't be lost forever. Maybe someday we could piece her back together. Our house crumbled around us, and we did our best to raise ourselves. The ceilings were water damaged, the bottom stairs rotted, and during the winters the radiators bled rust. Yet it was still our home, and Annie made it a haven. My sister Annie took care of me with uneven bandages on bruised knees and lukewarm microwave meals. She told me ghost stories and didn't mind when I crawled into her bed, too frightened to sleep alone. She taught me to dance barefoot on the living room carpet, with the music channel blasting from the TV, shaking our hips before they were fully developed. She always let me shower first so the water was hot, never complaining when she had to make do with the cold. She brushed my hair every day before school, even when I screamed and hit her when she encountered tangles. Annie had dark hair like our father, whoever he had been, but I was blonde. Annie longed to be blonde too, like Marilyn Monroe, like Mom. I think she thought it would bring her closer to Mom, make Mom think less of her dad. I'd give anything to have her hands in my hair one more time, even if it hurt. She moved to New York when I turned 18 and never came back. I still dream about her sometimes. Keeping up with our mother was impossible, and we learned from a young age that we would always be left behind. It didn't make it any easier. When she drank lightly, she was radiant, waking us up at 3 a.m. with pancakes dripping in cherry syrup. Sometimes when the weather was right and she had grown tired of drinking alone, she'd call our school and say we had both caught summer sickness, and we'd drive to the beach instead. I remember being 9 years old in the back seat of the car, returning home after one of our ocean outings, sucking the salt from my fingers. Annie had just dyed her hair blonde, with her best friend Jane helping her lean over our kitchen sink. From behind, I couldn't tell who was the mother and who was the daughter, radio on high and windows down, letting the sky in. When she drank heavily, she'd be out all night, her hair piled up like a beauty queen's, eyes glazed and outlined with glitter and black. Sometimes she'd be gone for a day or two. She would never tell us when, and one day we'd wake up to an empty house with the fridge stocked full, a Post-it note on the front with a smear of Mom's lipstick in the shape of a kiss, saying she'd be back soon. Sometimes she'd bring men home, filling the table with beer cans and ashtrays, smoke filling the ceiling. Mom lost in the haze. We'd sleep with pillows over our heads, trying to drown out the music they blasted until the early morning, and wake up to strangers at our kitchen table, asking where we kept the coffee. When Mom drank too little, she fell apart. She wouldn't buy food, and the refrigerator was a gaping hole in the wall. She'd chain smoke, leaving cigarette burns on the wallpaper up the stairs as if the walls were sick and decaying. She barely slept, wandering around with dark circles under her eyes and raw knuckles. She would scream at the slightest thing. I remember once spilling a glass of juice on the couch. She looked at me with dead eyes, dragged me onto the carpet, then took every cushion off the couch and set them on fire in the backyard. Annie watched from the window for a while before sitting next to me on the floor, our backs against the remains of the seats, her head resting in the hollow of my collarbone. When Mom drank too much, it was the worst. She'd laugh too loudly and too long at everything, until her mouth shook and she started crying, at the breakfast table, into her cereal. Annie would shut down when Mom was like this, retreating deep inside herself where no one could hurt her. She'd stay up until morning, watching old black and white movies on TV, whispering lines she knew by heart like prayers. When I was 5, I'd cry when I found Mom passed out cold on her bed, convinced she would never wake up. Annie would wipe my tears, telling me she was only sleeping, like the princesses in my storybook. We'd sit on Mom's bed together and wait for her to wake up. When we were older, I was the one who would pick Mom up off the bathroom floor repeatedly, and Annie would put her to bed, smoothing her hair off her face and cleaning the vomit from her mouth, changing her clothes if she had wet herself. Watching them, there was no doubt that Annie was the mother now. It was October and I was 13, Annie 16. It was a Wednesday night and Mom had been gone for 2 days. She'd called us that morning from a payphone, her voice slurring, telling us she was having a great time with new friends and hoped we were doing well. When she asked if I was having a good birthday, I hung up on her. My birthday had been the day before. Annie had given me a pile of presents, strawberry lip glosses, and glittery nail polishes. I didn't ask where she got the money for them. I didn't care. We took the bus to the beach with Jane, ate the birthday cake she made for me, sand getting into the frosting. It tasted like sweetness and the sea, and I savored every bite and grain of sugar against my teeth. We watched the sun set, Annie snapping grainy photos on her old Nokia as I blew out my candles, wishing repeatedly that Mom wouldn't come home, that she'd just stay gone this time. But that Wednesday night, Annie and I weren't speaking. Anger hung heavily between us, seeping through the floorboards. It started when she tripped at the bottom of the stairs. We both laughed, Annie throwing her head back, the gap between her front teeth catching the light. When I bent to help her up, I caught her breath, warm against the freckles on my cheeks. I let go of her arms and she fell again, hitting the floor and grinning, shaking her hair from her face. Her breath was heavy with whiskey. I couldn't start picking her up again, couldn't watch her fall repeatedly. Just like Mom, I knew she'd never get back up. I stared at her, blonde hair falling into her eyes, and all I saw was our mother. Then I ran, my feet pounding the hallway like heartbeats unleashed. I ran to the kitchen and poured every bottle we had down the sink, shoving Annie back as she tried to stop me, catching liquor on her fingers as it fell. She grabbed my shoulders and made me drop the last bottle. It smashed between us on the floor, glass shards glistening as if we had pulled stars from the sky and shattered them, pieces we could never put back. Outside, through the open windows, the sky turned pale gold. Clouds, a mix of pink and cream, smeared across the horizon. I cried, watching Annie on her knees picking up the pieces. That was Annie, always trying to fix things even when it was too late. The smell of food drew me from my room, my stomach betraying me. Annie was cooking pasta, real food, not from the microwave. She had set the table, Tammy Wynette singing softly from the CD player, Annie gently swaying her hips as she stirred the rich and warm tomato sauce. As we ate in silence with every bite, I forgave her. Mom never cooked dinner, never remembered my favorite was spaghetti since I was a kid, or stayed sober long enough to sit at the table. Annie wasn't Mom. We were washing the dishes when we first heard it. A moth crawled down the inside of the pane, and I cracked the window to let it out into the darkness. From the backyard came a faint sound. I tilted my head to listen, as it was coming from far off, crying. I thought it was Mika, the 2-year-old next door, having a tantrum loud enough for us to hear, or maybe even Lucky Strike, the cat from down the street, begging for food like he sometimes did. I always wanted to feed him when he came around, winding over my ankles, but Annie always stopped me, saying once you start giving, they never stop taking. Looking back, I don't think she was talking about the cat. Annie flipped the Christmas lights strung around the porch, and we sat on the plastic beach chairs, watching the skies. When we were little, we'd sit outside, and Annie would tell me the names of all the constellations and the stories of how they got there. I had to grow up before I realized she made them all up as she went along. It was a game we still enjoyed, making up ridiculous stories for the shapes we could pick out. Ah, yes, that one there is the Coors Light. It got there when God dropped it out of his convertible window and never picked it up, she said, nodding seriously and hiding her smile. Of course, I said, waving my hands and pointing up past the power lines. Right next to the ashtray, left there by angels on a smoke break. Yeah, they say if you wish on it, all your dreams will come true, said Annie, grinning. She stopped laughing, voice quieter, face tilted up to all those dead stars. Let's wish, Emmy. Let's wish. So we did. The sound of crying interrupted us. It was closer this time, and definitely human. We turned to each other, confused. Annie shrugged and I squinted out into the black. It sounded like a baby, lost and tired and alone. It must be Mika, I said, slowly getting to my feet. Maybe he walked around the back. Shit, do you want to call Connie and tell her we'll bring him over? Annie didn't reply and I sighed, rolling my eyes. Guess I'll do everything then. I stepped off the porch, grass soft against my heels. The air smelled like it might rain, fresh and clean and growing. A promise unfulfilled. Annie's voice was strained. I turned to her, smiling. It died on my face when I saw the look on her own. Get inside now. She was staring out into the dark past me, opening the door with one hand behind her, fingers fumbling on the catch. I froze, barefoot in the dirt. I'd found what she was looking at. In the bushes by the back fence was a person, crouched with their knees tucked up neat under the chin, arms wrapped around legs. Their mouth hung wide, softly opening and closing as he cried, like a child lost in the dark. Not like a child, but a someone pretending, mimicking the sound, open and closed out in the blackness. Suddenly they straightened, snapping upright face still hidden by the black. They were tall and thin, too thin to be a normal person. Panic made me move. Animal instincts left over from the days we lived up in the trees carrying me forward. I was faster than Annie, dragging her inside and slamming the door behind us, hearing it bounce on its hinges as I locked it. We watched as the person slowly walked towards the house, steps deliberate and long. Annie reached for my hand, holding me tight and turned me to face her, holding my shoulders. Don't turn around, Emmy. Don't turn around. Instinctively, I started to look over my shoulder, out into the darkness. Annie grabbed my face, hard, and shook her head. I knew then she was serious. Her voice cracked, and she cleared her throat, gripping my hand tight enough to hurt, nails digging in, grounding herself. I looked down at our fingers interlocked. Both of us grown from the same bones. I'm gonna call the cops and everything is going to be... Her voice faltered, stuttering. Tears spilled over her lashes, dripping like the promise of rain. Annie never cried. Your phone's on the porch, she whispered, and bile crawled its way up my throat. Her phone was upstairs, charging. A soft tapping filled the silence. Annie turned to the window, eye whites showing her eyes were so wide. It was the sound of someone's forehead against the glass, slowly, over and over. They started to speed up, faster and harder, skin meeting glass until they was slamming into the window hard enough to shake the panes. The tapping stopped and I was about to ask Annie if I could look now when she screamed, followed by the sound of cracking glass and the loudest slam yet. Whoever was in our yard had just smashed their face hard enough into the window to break it. We ran upstairs, two at a time, skipping the ones caved in with dry rot on instinct. I turned behind me once and Annie yanked my face back before I could see. The sound of broken glass echoed behind us as we made it to the bathroom, locking the door. A thin, wailing cry, like a baby calling for its mother, filled the hallway, trapped between the walls and locked doors. Annie threw her back against the door, feet jammed up against the bathtub, clutching the knife she had grabbed from the kitchen. I did the same, shoulder to shoulder. Slow footsteps started on the stairs, deliberate and casual. The crying had become mocking, almost laughter, shrill bursts of sound and then giggles, high-pitched and abruptly stopping before starting again. The first door on the upstairs floor was my bedroom, and we heard the distinct sound of it slamming open. They were looking for us. "What the fuck is going on?" I asked Annie, not even bothering to brush away the tears that I couldn't stop falling. I watched my sister pick herself up off the floor and brace her hands on the door as we heard the sound of a second door slamming open. Mom's room, the next room on the hallway, was the bathroom. Annie pulled me to my feet and handed me the knife. I shook my head and pushed it back to her, terrified of what would happen if I had to use it. Annie shoved me and pressed the knife into my hands, thumb pressing hard enough on the blade to bleed. I watched my sister's blood drip down her wrist, a winding red road, still pushing into my hands despite the pain. I took the knife. Something slammed against the wall that Mom's room shared with the bathroom. A high-pitched wail followed. I held my breath, could feel my heart beat in the base of my throat, a wild and frantic thing. "I'm gonna get the phone from my room." I shook my head violently, about to argue. Annie clamped a hand over my mouth. I could taste the blood on her hand, salty and sweet, like birthday cake by the ocean. "Yes, I'm gonna get the phone, and I'm gonna call the cops, and we're going to be okay." I shook my head again. "It's the only way. When I go, I need you to lock the door, and you don't open it for anything or anyone. Not for me, not for anyone. Promise me." I shook my head and Annie pressed her hand into my mouth, crushing my teeth against my lips so it made my eyes water. "Yes, promise me, Em." Something smashed in the room next door. Annie brushed the hair off my face, gently tucking it behind my ear. "Promise," she mouthed and unlocked the door as slowly as possible, bolt scraping gently. I watched the curve of her shoulder disappear into the black hall outside, like the moon in eclipse. And then she was gone. I couldn't move or breathe for a second, and then I slammed the bolt shut just as something bounced off the outside of the door. A high-pitched scream followed, handle rattling up and down hard enough to pop one of the screws. I watched it roll towards me on the tiles, and then silence. I sat with my back to the door, holding the knife and wishing I was holding Annie's hand instead. Still silence. Nothing but me and my lungs slowly filling the room with my breath. "Em?" came a voice through the door. I started, hands gripping the knife. "Honey, what's going on?" "Mom?" My voice cracked. "Mama, is that you?" I wrapped my arms around myself, shaking, trying to keep myself still. "Sweetie, it's okay, just open the door. It's okay, just let me in." The handle rattled again, gentler. "Just let me in, it's all okay." She banged on the door, and I took my handle of the bolt. "Honey, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I missed your birthday. I'm sorry I'm such a terrible mother. Please." Her voice broke, and she started to cry. "Just let me in, baby. I'm so sorry." I screwed my eyes shut. She sounded so sad and so lost. I just wanted her to hold me like when I was a kid, and I'd come in off the swings with a scraped knee. Maybe this time she meant it. Maybe it would all be okay. My hand found its way to the bolt again. My sister's voice came through the door, warm and gentle. "Yeah, Emily, let us in. It's all okay." My hand froze on the bolt, and I tightened my grip on the knife. Annie never called me by my full name. A hand banged on the door, handle rattling. "Emily, let us in!" Annie's voice became low and guttural, followed by the same shrill giggles from before. Mom spoke now, pleading and crying, voice getting louder and louder. "Let us in! Let us in! Let us in!" Over and over again, punctuated by her fists on the door. I thought about demons and monsters, all the bedtime stories we prayed don't crawl out from under the bed. "That's not my sister, and you're not my mother," I screamed through the door, hands over my head. I climbed into the bathtub and curled in a ball, cradling myself, knife clutched to my chest. I didn't know what it was outside that door, but I knew it wasn't Annie. It wasn't the voice that yelled at when I changed TV channel, the one that sang me happy birthday, the one that told me I was smart even when I got bad grades, the one that read me stories about princesses that never wake up. It wasn't human. Bangs and yells came from downstairs, followed by the footsteps of people running. A low guttural howl ripped through the house, filling the room until I felt like I was drowning in the sound, and then the door was kicked in. I screamed, covering my eyes, waiting to die. Arms found me and lifted me from the tub, carrying me from the room. I looked at the outside of the door as I was carried downstairs. It was covered in long, scraping claw marks, dragged down to the floor. Pillows ripped apart covered the hallway in soft down, like it had snowed inside. I watched them drift slowly as men in uniforms checked each of the rooms that looked like they had been torn apart by something feral. Outside in our driveway were police cars and an ambulance. In the middle of it all was Annie, bathed in blue and red light as it washed over her, lit up in the dark like a neon angel, face aglow. I threw myself from the cop's shoulder and ran to her, holding us both together, broken pieces and all, standing under all those constellations we made up. Gentle screaming came from the ambulance, which rocked occasionally. Annie gently turned my head away, smiling so sadly it made my chest ache as I understood. Turns out there was no demon, no wild animal or bad men trying to break in. Just Mom, out of her mind on booze and drugs and everything in between, coming to the end of a week-long binge. Something had finally broken inside her head, and this time we couldn't put her back together no matter how hard we tried. Sometimes you fall one last time and you never get back up. Annie had seen her in the garden, blood dribbling from her mouth, track marks bulging on her forearms like unmapped roads, rail thin and desperate for one more hit, one more fix. She'd searched the kitchen for all the drink I'd thrown away, and when she hadn't found it, had come to hunt for the stash she hid in the bathroom. She hadn't wanted me, just the drugs on the other side of the door, so high she could mimic Annie's voice almost perfectly. Turns out the real monsters are the ones that eat you alive slowly, the kind that come in a bottle or a needle or at the end of a long list of reasons why you can't get out of bed in the morning. Sometimes the monsters are the ones that raise you or love you the most, but it's up to you if you let them in. As the night unfolds, the sisters' fight for survival reveals a deeper horror, the relentless grip of addiction, manifesting in their mother's final, terrifying moments. The true monster here is not a shadowy figure lurking in the darkness, but the slow, consuming force that twists and warps those it touches. In the end, it's clear that the greatest battles are often fought against the things that claim to love us the most. The story leaves us with a sobering reflection on the nature of addiction and its devastating impact. If you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think of the true nature of the monsters in our lives? Stay tuned for more stories that explore the darkest corners of the human experience. In the midst of a relentless downpour, an old stray dog was rescued by Emily, a gesture that seemed innocuous at first. But as the rain-soaked canine, later named Buster, settled into the family's home, a sense of unease began to creep in. With its tattered collar and mysterious past, Buster's arrival marked the beginning of a series of unsettling events that would soon spiral into a nightmare. What started as a simple act of kindness would unravel into a chilling tale of terror, blurring the lines between reality and something far more sinister. As we delve into this story, it's clear that not all strays bring warmth to a home. It had been pouring rain most of the day. The forecast the day before had predicted light showers, but this downpour was intense. I glanced out the window, and in the late afternoon gloom, I could see rainwater streaming down both sides of the road. My parents were starting to worry about my sister. Emily had been at a friend's place all day and was supposed to have returned an hour ago. Just as my father was about to hop into his car to search for her, the front door opened. Emily stepped inside, still wearing her yellow raincoat. To my parents' surprise, she was holding onto the worn collar of an old, drenched dog. The dog was clearly a mix, though I could see the Alsatian in it, and maybe some golden retriever. As I tried to figure out the breed, I mentally added dog breeder to my list of possible career paths. My parents exchanged apprehensive glances as Emily smiled awkwardly and explained how she found him shivering in the rain on the side of the road. There was something about its eyes, she said, that made her instantly feel sorry for the poor guy. My dad knelt by the dog and had a look at its collar. It was battered, its red color fading, and it had no name, phone number, or address written on it. My father stood up with a sigh and told Emily that he'd bring the mutt to the vet on Thursday to see if it had been chipped. And for the 5 days until then, looking after it would be her responsibility. Emily beamed at my dad and took the dog into the kitchen to towel it down. Later on that evening, she brought it back into the living room and informed us that his name was Buster. My father warned against getting too attached, but she didn't listen. She spent the rest of the day playing with Buster and sending pictures of him to her friends. That night, Buster slept on a makeshift bed of old blankets and cardboard in the kitchen. My parents prayed that he wouldn't make a mess of the place at night. Emily hugged Buster and gave him another treat before rushing off to her room. In the morning, all was well. It looked like Buster hadn't moved an inch. The dopey guy barely looked up at us when we crowded into the kitchen for breakfast. Immediately, Emily knelt beside him, rubbing his tummy and stroking his fur. I think Emily was too afraid of taking Buster for a walk, just in case she bumped into his owners and they dragged him away from her. The garden had been turned to mud the day before, and there wasn't a chance in hell that my mother would let that dog back in the house if he had a trace of muck on his paws. So he, like the rest of us, spent that day cooped up inside. Not that he seemed to mind. My dad cooked up a lamb chop for Buster that night at Emily's request. It was the most animated I've seen him. His eyes lit up as it was placed in front of him, and we all erupted into laughter as he tore into it. That night, I jolted awake. The radio alarm clock on my bedside cabinet informed me in analog red light that it was 4:37. I lay there but quickly began to fall back to sleep. As I was, I could have sworn I heard something moving around in the hallway. I assumed it was my dad stumbling to the bathroom in a drunken stupor, and for the second time that night, sleep took me. I spent most of the next day hanging out with friends around town. We rode our bikes, threw stones at the windows of the old house on Mill Street, and dared each other to shoplift from the local off-brand gas station. I made off with a packet of apple-flavored chewing gum. When I came home, things felt different, hostile. I didn't want to ask what happened, but before I could slink off to my room, my mother told me. Emily had accidentally knocked over my grandfather's urn while playing with Buster in the front room. I suppressed a chuckle at the thought of how much trouble she'd be getting in. Mature of me, I know. That evening, there was silence around the dinner table, broken only by Buster's whining. I woke up again that night. This time I swung myself out of bed, My mouth was dry and my breath left a stale taste at the back of my throat. I wandered downstairs to the kitchen to get a glass of water. I tried to be as silent as possible, not wanting to disturb the sleeping dog. Buster slept soundly in his little bed, and I knew a freight train going past wouldn't wake him. I poured a glass of water and drank it in a continuous gulp. Then an idea came to me. I crouched by the cabinet my dad kept his whiskey in. I opened it, trying not to let the hinges creak. I picked out a bottle and stood up. I gently unscrewed the cap and took a sip. I coughed and choked and spluttered. As I went for another sip, I heard movement upstairs. I knew my father would kill me if he caught me drinking. I hastily put the cap back on and placed it back in the cupboard. I speed walked out the kitchen, desperate not to make a noise. Just before I began ascending the stairs, I heard the door to my parents' room open. I quickly turned around and hid in the living room. I heard my father walk down the stairs and into the kitchen. My heart was beating like a tribal drum as I hurried out of the living room, and I stepped, agonizingly loudly, up each creaky step back to my bedroom. I thought I had made it, but just as I was pushing my bedroom door open, I heard a voice behind me. It was my father. He'd popped his head out of his bedroom. He asked if it was me moving around. I told him that I'd just gone downstairs to get a glass of water. He told me to keep it down, and before he retreated back into the darkness of his room, I saw my mother stirring in the bed behind him. He closed the door. That morning I woke up with a migraine. Nothing too major, but it was a drawback from what would have otherwise been a great day. My sister was at some dance club, my mother was visiting the solicitor in town, and my father had gone golfing. On this rare occasion, I had the house to myself. Well, me and the dog. I found a strongly worded note on the kitchen table when I woke up. It was left by Emily, telling me how I should feed and entertain Buster while she was gone. I crumpled it up and attempted to throw it into the bin from across the room, missing horribly. I made myself the unhealthiest breakfast I could think of. I took it into the living room to eat while I settled down to watch a film, Dan O'Bannon's Night of the Living Dead. That's how I spent the morning. Later on, I took my empty plate into the kitchen. I figured if my mother saw that I cleaned the dishes, she wouldn't be as critical when she found the crumbs. I walked past Buster, who was slumped in his usual stop in the corner of the room, on a bed of now dirty sheets. In a joking manner, I asked him how his day was while I washed up. Obviously, I got no reply. I remembered my sister's note and set a half-dried glass down while I fetched Buster some treats. I didn't know where Emily kept them, so I grabbed a slice of overly processed ham from the fridge. I crouched beside him and dangled it in front of his snout, teasing him. There was no response. No slow opening of the eyelids, no methodic wag of the tail. There were no signs of life at all. I gasped and put my hand on his stomach, trying to feel it rise with his breath, or a heartbeat, anything. To my horror, his abdomen began to compress when I did, like a limp, deflating balloon. He felt hollow, empty. I scrambled to my feet and stumbled backwards. As I put my hand on the counter, I knocked over a glass. It shattered on the kitchen floor, but Buster didn't so much as flinch. I panicked and ran up to my room. I took my phone from my bedside cabinet and hastily rang my mother. It rang for a brief moment before she picked up. I managed to stutter out that there was something wrong with the dog, that it was an emergency. She assured me that she had just picked up Emily and would be home in 10 minutes. And with that, she hung up. I set my phone down and paced around the room. As I was thinking, I heard a noise coming from the first floor. It sounded like someone moving around. I assumed it was my mother, home earlier than she estimated. I made my way downstairs to greet her, hurrying over the creaking steps. There was no one. The door was still locked, and I, as far as I knew, was alone in the house. I heard the now familiar wag of Buster's tail as he came bounding up to me from the hall. I looked at him puzzled as he nestled his head into my leg. I stroked him behind the ears as he mewed low. I then heard the equally familiar jangling of keys as the front door was unlocked. My mother stepped inside, pumping her umbrella. Emily, who was close beside her, ran to Buster and dropped to her knees as soon as she saw him. She hugged him tight and whispered in his flea-bitten ear. I could see her eyes were red, raw from crying. My mother asked me what the big emergency was, and I paused before answering. I explained that he had been unresponsive, but he seems fine now. My mother let out a long, drawn-out sigh as she made her way past us and into the kitchen. She called my name, frustrated, when she saw the broken shards of glass on the kitchen floor. I had forgotten about that. Emily spent the rest of the day in her room with the dog. At dinner, neither me or my mother mentioned anything about Buster's false alarm. We just let my dad witter on about improving his backswing, whatever that meant. For the third night in a row, I jolted awake in the small hours of the morning. I groaned at the abrupt ending of a good dream, tossing and turning until I found a comfy position. As I tried to get back to sleep, I began to feel a presence. It was the feeling you get during an awkward silence, when you become painfully aware of the other person. I sat up in bed and rubbed my eyes, trying to adjust them to the darkness. There was someone in the corner of my room, I was certain of it. I could make out the vague shadow-covered silhouette standing just beyond the foot of my bed. I was almost paralyzed with fear, but my right hand managed to creep over to my bedside cabinet. I fumbled as I felt for the familiar switch of the lamp. Just before I turned it on, the figure in my room bolted. I recoiled in shock as I realized my half-asleep mind had been right. Someone had been standing there, watching. As the moon emerged from a bank of clouds, my room was briefly lit with a dull glow. In that half-light, I saw the outline of a tall man slink out of my room and into the darkness of the hall. I didn't realize I was screaming until my father burst into my room moments later. He switched the lights on, which burned my eyes. He held me and asked what was wrong. With snot and tears dripping down my face, I managed to stutter out that there had been someone in my room. At this, my dad turned and ran back into his room. His caring embrace was quickly replaced with my mother's. He emerged with a baseball bat in his hands, gasping it so hard his knuckles were white. My mother went to check on Emily. She made me come with her, not waiting to let her children out of her sight. Me barged into Emily's room. She was already awake, sitting upright in bed. My mother fired a barrage of questions at her. Dazed, Emily told us that she hadn't seen anything. My father came into the room 10 minutes later. He informed us that he did a sweep of the house and found nothing. No signs of a break-in, no mysterious intruder. He brought me back to my room. Once I was in bed, he sat by my side and explained to me that I probably just had a bad dream. He said there was nothing to be afraid of and joked that if someone did break into the house, they'd soon be scared off by Buster, the world's greatest guard dog. Eventually, I mustered the courage to fall back asleep. The next morning, everyone in the family was noticeably tired, even the dog. We greeted each other with yawns and joked about the previous night's events. I didn't know that this was the start of the last truly happy day of my life. My parents went out shopping, Emily took Buster for his first proper walk, and I spent most of the day gaming. It was a normal day. I've had dozens just like it. We had chicken breasts and bland steamed vegetables for dinner. Wednesday was family night, so after dinner we came together in the living room to play a board game. Tonight it was Cluedo. Buster was curled up at Emily's feet. My father thought then was a good time to remind her that tomorrow he was bringing the dog to the vet and would hopefully reunite him with his real owners. At this, Emily screamed that she was his real owner. She stormed out of the room, Buster following close behind. As soon as she slammed the door behind her, my dad signed. He said he knew my sister would get too attached to that dog. This was the sour note the day ended on. At 10, I did my usual routine. I brushed my teeth, changed into my pajamas, and listened to music for half an hour or so before turning over and going to sleep. As I expected, I woke up again in the middle of the night. This time, I was too afraid to move, too afraid to open my eyes and see what could be lurking in my room. Instead, I kept them tightly shut and tried desperately to go back to sleep. After laying in bed for what felt like hours, but must have only been 20 minutes, I decided to open my eyes. I was filled with a directionless dread as I slowly peeped out over my duvet. Since I had woken up, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I was being watched. As I pulled the covers away from my face, I saw who had been staring at me. My bedroom door was wide open, and sitting perfectly still in the doorway was Buster. His head was craned slightly and looking directly at me. I chuckled to myself, realizing that I had been terrified over nothing. I swung my legs out of bed and got up. I took Buster by the collar and began to lead him back downstairs to his bed. As I walked down the hall, I noticed that the door to my sister's room was ajar. I brought Buster into the kitchen and watched as he lay down on the crumpled mess of cardboard and old blankets that he slept on. I smiled as he slumped his head onto his paws and closed his dreary eyes. I wouldn't exactly call him my best friend, but I'd miss him after tomorrow. I turned to leave, to crawl back into bed and finally get some rest. But something caught my eye from out of the kitchen window. I leaned against the sill and looked out onto the cold night. The moon was a perfect crescent, half hidden by the clouds. Light pollution from the nearby city robbed the sky of stars. But as I stared into the darkness, I caught a glimpse of a shooting star. As I gazed in awe to see if I could see another one, I saw someone. There was a person leaning against the fence along our front driveway. I quickly realized it was Emily. I could make much out in the darkness, but I could see that she looked nervous. I was about to open the window and call out to her when I heard something behind me. I turned around and realized it was coming from the dog. I assumed he had yelped in his sleep, maybe stuck in some bad dream, but then I noticed something else. His skin was moving. Rather, there was something moving around just under the surface of his skin. I didn't have time to think what it could be before I saw the long, crimson-red fingers protrude from his stomach. They grabbed onto either side of the now gaping wound and parted his abdomen like curtains. Once the opening was wide enough, the unnaturally long arm reached out, snaking across the kitchen floor until it grabbed the dining table's leg. It held onto it tightly as it began to pull the rest of it out. I couldn't comprehend how something so large could have fit inside of that animalistic facade. Eventually, it was fully out and stood upright. The figure must have been at least 3 meters tall. It was hunched over where it met the ceiling. It looked like it had been skinned. Its lanky body was made up of exposed sinew and muscle. The thing's eyes were milk white and bulging out of its vaguely dog-shaped head. It was grotesque. With a streak of urine running down my leg, I turned around and ran as fast as I could upstairs. I burst into my parents' bedroom and stood in front of their bed, screaming and wailing about some monster. They were both shaken awake at my outpour of terror. My father was calm at first. He tried to sit me down and tell me that it had all been a bad dream, like the night before. I pushed him away and tried to articulate between screams that there was a monster downstairs and we had to leave. My father quickly became furious. His anger at me was only amplified by his tiredness. He grabbed my shaking hand and began to shout that at 14, I was too old for this, for any of this. But I was hysterical, and his attempt at reasoning did nothing. As I kept on wailing, he and my mother began to half lead, half drag me back into my own room. Kicking and screaming, I fell to my bedroom floor. I jolted at the noise of the slamming of my door and got to my feet. With tears streaking down my red cheeks, I pounded the door. I heard my father's voice on the other side pleading with me to calm down. Our shouting reached a fever pitch, and then silence. We both stopped and listened out for the repetition of the noise that had brought our heated argument to an end. The dull thudding noise came again, this time accompanied by a shrill creak. I realized it was the sound of something climbing the stairs. I took a tentative step back as the noise drew closer and closer. In a weak voice, I heard my father stutter, "What? What are you?" I knew what he had seen. I've spent the last 11 years blocking out the memory of what came next. There was screaming and pleading, the sound of flesh ripping and bone shattering. I sat motionless on the carpet of my bedroom floor as viscose blood began seeping in from under the door. The sounds or carnage stopped, and I held my breath as there was perfect silence once again. This silence was broken by the sound of my door slowly creaking open. I was petrified with fear. I could do anything. Couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't breathe. The thing opened my door a crack before stopping. The slowly thudding noise returned as it walked away from the scene until I couldn't hear anything more. I stayed welded to the spot for a minute or two before grief hit me like a bus. I began crying until my eyes were raw. I stood up and took my phone from my bedside cabinet. I dialed 911 and desperately tried to explain what had happened. I glanced out of my window and my jaw went slack. Walking down the middle of our street was the creature, caked in blood the same shade as its taut skin. Holding its hand and walking next to it was Emily. She stared up at it with affection. The two were illuminated by the streetlights, and I saw that the creature was holding the fur suit that had once been Buster in the talons of its other hand. I watched as they walked down the street, across the sidewalk and into the forest that surrounded my neighborhood. That was the last time I saw my sister. Within the hour, the police came. They cordoned off the area and took me in. I spent the next few years in foster care. The official statement they had given was that it was a kidnapping gone wrong. Only I and the officers and coroner who saw my parents' remains knew that it was something much more sinister. That was 11 years ago. Tonight, I finish writing this before I begin a journey that I should have undertaken a long, long time ago. Emily is still out there somewhere, and I am going to find her. As the story concludes, the chilling revelation of Buster's true nature leaves us with a haunting sense of dread. What seemed like a benign addition to the family became the harbinger of unimaginable horror. This tale serves as a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that some secrets lie hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to be exposed. Have you ever encountered something that seemed harmless, only to discover it held a dark secret? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Imagine a perfect Halloween night with friends, and you decide to try a new, eerie game. It might seem like a harmless prank, but if you don't follow the rules exactly, you could open a door to horrors beyond imagination. Today, we're diving into a game known as the face game. It sounds simple, but if you don't stick to the rules, you might unleash a terrifying world you can't escape from. Join me as we uncover just how frightening this game can be and whether there's truly something haunting behind it. The face game can be played by 4 or more people. Players must begin the game alone and in absolute darkness. If any sources of light or observers are present, the game will fail. But the game itself is simple. Players stand in a circle with one player in the center. The player in the center is called the judge. The players who form the circle are called the pretenders. In the center of the circle, the judge spins counterclockwise while the pretenders rotate clockwise around them. The players continue to spin until the judge announces in a loud voice, I wonder, whose face will I find?" The pretenders then freeze and take 3 steps backward, widening the circle. The judge can no longer be sure who or what is standing where. They must approach the first pretender and attempt to identify them by touching their face. If the judge touches any part of a pretender apart from their face, or if a pretender moves or speaks, the game fails. A pretender can sneer, scrunch up their nose, or otherwise manipulate their face to make themselves more difficult to identify. When the judge is confident about a pretender's identity, the judge announces loudly, "This face belongs to the pretender's full true name." If the judge is incorrect, the face game ends. Otherwise, the game continues and the judge approaches the next pretender. If the judge correctly identifies all of the pretenders, the judge wins and the face game ends. If a pretender successfully deceives the judge, the pretenders win and the face game ends. There is, however, a third possible outcome. During the face game, it is possible that the judge might touch a face that they are unable to identify, a face that belongs to someone or something that wasn't present when the game began, the outsider. The judge must take their time with the face of the outsider, being sure to touch every part. They must not be discouraged or frightened by weeping sores, strange protrusions, or squirming things beneath the outsider's flesh. Even if the outsider bites the judge, licks them, or makes its skin abrasive, the judge must continue until they have touched every part of the outsider's face. The pretenders must remain in their places. They must not move or speak, regardless of any foul odors, unnatural sounds, or changes in temperature that the outsider might produce. When the judge has completely touched every part of the outsider's face, they must loudly announce, "I do not know who this face belongs to, but surely it is the most beautiful face of all." The outsider then disappears, and the face game ends. However, if the pretenders move or speak, if the judge fails to completely touch the outsider's face, or doesn't pronounce the game-ending phrase correctly, or if the outsider successfully impersonates one of the pretenders, the outsider wins the face game. And what happens if the outsider wins the face game? My best friends and I found out on Halloween night, 1999. Light as a feather, stiff as a board. Light as a feather, stiff as a board, the five of us chanted. But Amy didn't budge. My fingers hurt. I was starting to sweat in Clara's stuffy, unfinished basement, and I thought that choosing our heaviest friend for the witchy ritual might not have been the best idea. I wanted desperately for it to work. I think we all did. Mostly because now that we were 12, Halloween had started to seem sort of lame. Erica had stolen her brother's copy of Scream, but it hadn't made us jump and shriek the way we used to. Eating so much candy had made us all feel sick to our stomachs, and the flickering tea candles Christina had set up felt cliché instead of spooky. We all wanted that special Halloween magic back, even if it was just for one more night. The basement door opened with a creak. We all jumped and let Amy drop. "Ow!" Amy groaned, clutching her head. Clara's older sister Holly stood backlit by the rectangle of light at the top of the basement stairs. "Are you still trying to do that stupid trick?" Holly sneered. "You know it's fake, right?" Holly was 2 years older than us, and according to herself, about 10 times cooler. Maybe it was just the sweltering basement or my frustration with our disappointing Halloween night, but I suddenly just couldn't take any more of Holly's superiority complex. "Oh, let me guess," I snapped. "I bet you know one that really works, right?" How I wish I could take those words back now. Holly's mouth opened and closed soundlessly a few times. She couldn't believe that one of her little sister's friends had actually talked back to her. "I do," Holly spat when her jaw finally started working again. "And I'll prove it." She slammed the basement door on her way out, and we could hear Clara's parents haranguing her upstairs. We all looked at each other and giggled. Holly was gone a long time. "Here." She stormed down the stairs and shoved a sheet of printed paper into my hands. "The face game," read the header. "This isn't some game you knew about," I snorted. "You just printed it off from somewhere. Look, the ink's not even dry. You're just too scared to play it. Anyway, I'm going to talk to my boyfriend, so do not come upstairs," Holly shouted over her shoulder before slamming the door and getting yelled at once again. We read through the instructions several times. It didn't seem complicated, but even as a preteen, I wondered about the face game. It seemed so simple, so anonymous. Who had created the face game? Why? At the time, I didn't have any answers. The five of us stood in a circle, waiting for Clara's parents to click off the television and go to bed. When the house was finally quiet, we began. I volunteered to be the judge. It had looked easy on paper, but spinning in circles in Clara's stuffy, pitch-black basement went to my head immediately. I had barely twirled 5 times when the floor began to feel wobbly beneath my feet. I wonder whose face will I find?" I shouted queasily, starting the game. It had sounded like there were a lot more than just my friend's footsteps circling around me in the dark. But when I spoke, all sound stopped. Standing dizzily in the complete darkness made me feel like an astronaut from one of the documentaries we watched in school, floating alone in the lightless, hostile void of space. With a shiver, I took a step forward, then another. Where were my friends? I held my out in front of me and staggered blindly forward. When my fingers touched flesh, I nearly shrieked. A face. Fortunately, the first one was easy. It was a round face with soft, pudgy features, and if that weren't enough, there wasn't a drip of sweat on it. That meant it could only belong to Amy, the girl we'd been trying to lift with our spell. I felt around her face just to be sure, then called out, "This face belongs to Amy Legan McCade." I heard Amy let out a sigh of relief. No one else spoke. The game would go on. The next face was bony and twitchy. Whoever it was didn't want to make it easy for me. They wrinkled their nose and lips so much that for a terrifying moment, I thought that I was touching the outsider described in the rules. But then I realized that whatever I was touching trimmed its eyebrows and used strawberry shampoo. Only one person I knew was such a pain. "This face belongs to Clara Simmons." "Wrong," Christina laughed. Sudden footsteps, a banged knee, cursing. Kelsey flipped the lights back on. I was standing in front of Christina. Clara was after her, the circle. The darkness had made me more sensitive to smell, I supposed, and besides, I'd figured that only Clara would try to trip me up. I'd forgotten how sneaky Christina could be. My friends, the pretenders, had won the face game. I felt my cheeks burning. Holly's stupid paper printout game had been more difficult than I thought, and I looked and felt like an idiot. I was angry with them, but even more angry with myself. "Well, since you won, Christina, why don't you be judged next?" I challenged her. Christina just shrugged. I realized that none of the others understand what I was so angry about. They didn't understand the tension and fear that came with being the judge, that weird sensation of touching a suddenly unfamiliar face in the dark. Before I knew it, the lights clicked off, and we began to spin. I don't know if Christina had a higher tolerance for dizziness or if she just wanted to show off, but she twirled for what felt like forever. Candy sloshed sickeningly in my stomach, and I wondered what would happen if someone passed out during the face game. I wonder, whose face will I find?" Christina sighed in a sing-song voice. We froze. After taking 3 steps back, that feeling was back. The sensation of being alone in the universe. There was nothing to do but wait for hands to touch my face. I heard shuffling feet, wiggling, a barely stifled giggle. "This face belongs to Clara Simmons," Clara groaned. Christina moved on. She barely took 2 minutes to identify the next pretender. "This face belongs to Erica Rebecca Moss." Christina was moving fast, maybe too fast. I heard her uncertain footsteps as she nearly walked outside the circle and had to double back, feeling her way through the dark just as I had. Suddenly, Christina gasped, then silence. What was taking her so long? And when had Clara's basement gotten so cold? I shivered. If it weren't for the total darkness, I was sure I would have been able to see my breath. A foul smell like rotten eggs invaded my nostrils. Something was wrong. I desperately wanted to ask Christina what was going on, and yet, If a pretender moves or speaks, the outsider wins the face game. I heard a sick gurgling noise followed by another, more recognizable sound. Christina weeping. I do not know whose face this is, Christina sobbed, but surely it is the most I couldn't take any more. I didn't care what happened after the game ended. It just had to stop. I stumbled forward into the pitch blackness, feeling for the light switch. I should have slipped on beanbags and candy wrappers or slammed into the basement furniture. I should have found the stairs. But the darkness seemed to go on forever. Clara? Christina? I asked nervously. No response. It was like my words had been swallowed up. I wrapped my arms around myself against the chill, but it was useless. The cold penetrated all the way to the bone. When I held my jaw to stop my teeth from chattering, I thought for sure I could hear someone screaming, but it felt very far away. No matter how far I walked forward or backwards, I couldn't reach the basement wall. I knelt down and touched the floor. Instead of Clara's carpet, I touched something as cold and smooth as ice. Is anyone there? I cried. From somewhere behind me, I heard a low rumbling sound that might have been laughter. The next thing I knew, I was blind. Ugh! A dark figure surrounded by light shouted down at me. What are you twerps doing down here? Mom and Dad are pissed. I knew that voice. Clara's older sister, Holly, at the top of the stairs once more. My friends were scattered around the basement like broken toys, terrified and exhausted, all except Christina. Christina stood in the center of the room, her face expressionless. She opened and closed her fingers and toes as if using them for the first time. She wriggled the muscles in her face as though trying to understand how to move them. And then she smiled. Your stupid game didn't work, Christina yelled up the stairs. The rest of us looked at each other. It had worked. Too well. Christina had touched the outsider. She should know that better than anyone. And yet, of course it didn't work. Holly rolled her eyes. I just printed it out from some message board so you losers wouldn't bother me while I talked to Brandon. He doesn't even like you, Christina said flatly. What? Holly's eyes grew wide. Why don't you ask Brandon what he did with Shelley Spicer from second period at Alex Hoffeld's homecoming party? Christina sneered. How do you know about that? Holly stammered. Anyway, Brandon didn't even go. He told me so. That wasn't what he told Shelley. Ask him. You'll see. Without another word, Holly slammed the door. We all stared. What? Christina shrugged, examining her fingernails. Holly Simmons is a bitch. She deserved it. Chris, what happened to you? I asked. Pfft. Christina snorted. Don't tell me you're still talking about that stupid game. Just before everything got weird, you found the outsider, didn't you? I heard you, but surely it is the most beautiful face of a... Don't tell me you actually fell for that. Christina threw her head back and laughed. I was just messing with you. You're still such a baby. I mean, none of the rest of you were scared, right? Christina looked from face to face. One by one, each of my friends shook their heads. I couldn't believe it. I'd seen how bewildered and frightened they were when the face game finally ended. I knew that, like me, they'd been shivering and lost, trapped in that cold, dark other place. I felt betrayed, but I couldn't blame them. There was a menacing new look in Christina's glare, as though something ancient and cruel was staring out from behind her eyes. I think, on a deeper level, I already knew the truth. The real Christina was gone forever, trapped in that freezing abyss, and maybe even destined to become an outsider herself. The thing that had come back inside her shell was something else entirely, an outsider, and it had no problem turning my friends against me. We were young, impressionable, and to be honest, afraid of what Christina had become. Throughout the fall and into the winter, Christina followed me. in the whirl of corner leaves as the yellow school bus rounded the corner. Just outside my bathroom stall at school, standing in the new fallen snow outside my bedroom window. She never spoke, but the message was clear. Never speak of what you know. Once she was confident of my silence, Christina, or the thing inside her, got to work on its favorite pastime, destroying the lives of the people around her. Her parents divorced, citing irreconcilable differences, but I knew the real reason. They wanted to escape from their daughter. They wanted to escape from the outsider. In time, Christina's sadistic games drove Kelsey and Erica away. They became her new targets, and the way she teased them throughout high school crossed the line from bullying to torture more than once. Those who stayed close to her weren't so lucky. She got Clara hooked on heroin our junior year, and Amy was killed in a car crash when Christina blackmailed her into driving drunk on prom night. Sometimes it was over quickly, sometimes it dragged on for years, but Christina always wrung every drop of suffering she could from the people around her before throwing them away. To her or its suffering seemed to be a sort of game. I usually kept my distance from hometown gossip, but in Christina's case, it was like being the spectator to a horrific natural disaster. I just couldn't look away. In dive bars and beauty salons, I learned of the careers she'd left in ruins, the relationships she'd wrecked, the pain and death that followed her like a black cloud. Eventually, she wound up in prison, given her love of cruel games, manipulation, and control. I'm sure she enjoyed every minute of it. I ran into one of the correctional officers who worked in her unit by chance a few years later. His name was Mark. He'd gone to high school with Christina and I, and like me, he was now terrified of her. I noticed a cast on his left arm. She basically rules the cell block. The inmates are all afraid of her, and so are the guards. You should hear the stories that the cops tell, the ones who arrested her in the first place. They said she was crawling up the walls like a goddamn spider, and that's not the worst of it. We were standing in the aisle of a busy supermarket, but I suddenly felt cold and alone like I had when we played the face game. Mark looked over his shoulder before continuing. The worst part is how she manipulates people. Know what I mean? I did. I thought of Erica with her head in a high school toilet, Clara with a needle in her arm, Amy's arm hanging out the door of a car wrapped around a tree. The other day, we caught her in an empty storage room with some other inmates. All the lights were off, and they were playing some sort of game. I shivered. Mark went on. We put her into solitary confinement after that, and solitary breaks, everybody. I've seen the toughest gangsters and most psychotic killers cry like babies after just a few days of solitary, but not her, not Christina. We could see her on the camera, just staring into space. Mark trailed off. He cleared his throat. Sorry if I seem a little freaked out by this. It's just, I was one of the COs who interrupted whatever game they were playing. And when the lights flickered on, I'd swear I saw something dark and horrible standing in the circle with the rest of them. It disappeared right away. And then I tried to put cuffs on Christina, and she snapped my wrist like a goddamn twig. He gestured to his arm. Look, don't tell many people in town about this, okay? I don't need everybody thinking I'm scared of a girl from high school. But he was scared. We both were, especially after I told him my side of the story. Mark believed me, and we kept tabs on Christina as best we could. But after she got out of prison, the trail went cold. It's only been a few weeks now, but I've noticed a disturbing trend. More and more people seem to be talking about the face game. When my friends and I played the face game, it was just some anonymous printout from an online chat room. Now it seemed to be showing up everywhere, in viral videos, in the conversations of kids walking home from school. Mark even found the rules of the face game stapled to a telephone pole near his house. It can only mean one thing. The outsider wearing Christina's skin is spreading the word about the face game. Is it trying to bring more of its kind to our world, or find its way back where it came from? I don't have any answers, but when I walk through the streets of my old hometown, looking at the happy expressions of families out for an autumn evening stroll, I hear a sing-song voice repeating in my mind, I wonder, whose face will I find? So we've just delved into the unforgettable story of the face game. Sometimes games that seem harmless can become gateways to unimaginable horrors. This story reminds us not only about the things we might accidentally invite into our lives, but also about the power of mysteries beyond our control. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever encountered a similar game or experience? Let me know. I'm always eager to hear your eerie and unsettling tales. Until next time, stay safe and remember, sometimes it's best not to mess with things you don't fully understand. In the heart of a seemingly tranquil forest, 5 friends set out for what was meant to be a celebratory camping trip. They were relishing their time together, sharing laughs and reminiscing about old memories. But as the night fell, an eerie sensation began to creep over their camp. It was supposed to be a simple getaway to celebrate their high school graduation, but soon an unsettling anomaly began to unravel their sense of reality. A 6th presence that shouldn't have been there. How could a tight-knit group of friends find themselves questioning their very perception of reality? This chilling tale delves into the unsettling moments when familiarity turns into paranoia, and the line between friend and foe blurs into the darkness of the unknown. There were bright flashes of red across the sky. It felt like someone was waving a flare from above, faint but noticeable. We all joked about UFOs and laughed while nailing our tents to the ground. I was sure that there were only 5 of us. We'd been friends since early middle school and were celebrating our high school graduation with this camping trip. The red flashes seemed to stop randomly as we talked while finishing up our tents. Dave managed to set up his tent the quickest and said he was going to gather some firewood. I remember that we worked together at the local gas station last year. We used to take the night shifts, making the otherwise dull job much more enjoyable. Eric, meanwhile, was still fiddling with his tent manual, adjusting his round glasses, as always. I wasn't as close to him as the others, but I do recall sharing a math class with him and borrowing his homework once. Ava was chatting with Sally, my cousin, and they had teamed up to work on one tent at a time. I have clear memories of them too, hanging out in our usual spots at school. In fact, I even remember Ava's younger brother, who always begged to tag along with us. I mention all of this because I was certain there were only 5 of us, and I knew everyone in the group. Dave went to gather some branches while we unfolded a few chairs and set them around the fire pit. I started feeling a little uneasy as the sun disappeared, and the forest was slowly consumed by the creeping darkness. The shadows of the trees grew longer as the minutes passed. Eric got up to grab a flashlight from his bag, and we all began wondering why Dave was taking so long. He returned shortly after, the sound of leaves rustling loudly as he approached. By then, we were already huddled in our chairs, covered up in our jackets, trying to stay warm. The temperature had dropped quickly, and a light breeze had started to stir. "Geez, you guys didn't even bother pulling out a chair for me," Dave said as he tossed the branches into the fire pit. We had already set up 5 chairs around the fire. I tried to make sense of the situation, but the harder I focused, the more my head felt foggy, like my thoughts were being pulled away. I had been thinking clearly up until then, but the moment I tried to figure out why 5 chairs were taken when Dave hadn't sat down yet, it was as if my brain just stopped. An uneasy feeling washed over me as I finally realized what was bothering me. The entire forest had gone completely silent. I glanced around at the others, and it was clear they felt it too. Eric was nervously fidgeting with his hands, trying to discreetly look at each of us, searching for the extra person. It was pointless. I scanned each face, all familiar, all visibly concerned, except for, all right, I'll get the chair myself, Dave said, breaking the tension slightly. I stood up and offered to help. He met my eyes and nodded, a hint of unease in his expression. We walked away from the fire pit toward the tents, but I kept glancing back at the group. "How many people are here?" I whispered to Dave as we walked. He looked around, suddenly realizing we had only brought 5 chairs. Each one of us had packed our own. They were heavy, so no one would have brought extras for no reason. "There's 5, right?" "I mean, there are 5 chairs," Dave replied, his voice shaky. "No, I think maybe one of us forgot theirs," I said, trying to avoid addressing the unsettling truth directly. My mind was doing everything it could to avoid confronting the idea that something was wrong. Whenever I tried to think about the 6th person, my head started pounding. "Yeah, that sounds right," Dave said, almost as if he was convincing himself. We returned to the fire pit, where now 2 chairs were empty, one for me and one for Dave. Suddenly, everything seemed to make sense again, even though we had all agreed earlier that it didn't. Sally suggested we were just tired from the hike and probably needed some rest. She could have been right. We had woken up at the crack of dawn to get here on time. Ava pulled out the drinks, and before long, we had gone through the entire 6-pack. We sat closer to the fire as we drank, sharing stories from the past year. Ava was midway through a creepy story about her house when I felt a cold chill run down my spine, despite the warmth of the fire. What had once felt comforting now felt sinister, and that's when I realized something was off. "Who started the fire?" I blurted out, cutting Ava off and causing everyone to stop and look at me. At first they seemed confused, but then I saw the change in their expressions as they realized none of them had an answer. I scanned their faces again, barely illuminated by the flickering light. Familiar faces, pale with fear. "Wasn't it you, Dave?" Eric asked. Dave shook his head. "I think the person standing behind Jenny did it," Sally said, pointing toward me. My heart leaped, and I spun around so fast it hurt my neck. But there was no one there, just the inky blackness of the forest looming behind me. The sight of the dark trees towering overhead made me feel exposed, like something was watching. "Wait, I don't know," Sally stammered, her eyes wide, body trembling. She kept darting her gaze around as Ava placed a calming hand on her shoulder. "I think we should leave," Ava stuttered. "Yeah, something feels wrong, but I can't figure out what," Dave agreed. "But it's too dark to go into the woods now. We'd get lost for sure," someone else said. "Yeah, I think we should stay and leave first thing in the morning," Eric suggested. I wanted to protest, but Eric was right. The darkness of the forest was overwhelming, and trying to navigate it now would be dangerous. "Let's not sleep in separate tents tonight," Sally proposed. We all nodded in agreement. Even though we only had single tents, we could squeeze in with each other. It was better than being alone. We got up to pair off. I stayed with Dave while Sally went with Ava. Eric was left without a partner, but we reassured him we would be close. Even then, he kept insisting he didn't have a pair. The realization slowly dawned on all of us. There were only 5 of us. "Why do we keep thinking there's 6 of us?" Eric asked, sweat beading down his forehead despite the cold air. My stomach twisted as I tried to recount everyone again. My head throbbed, but I forced myself to keep going. "There's me, Dave, Eric, Ava, Sally, and..." I pointed at each of them. My vision blurred, and a sharp pain shot through the left side of my head. My stomach lurched, and I doubled over, vomiting onto the ground. Dave caught me before I collapsed, holding me upright as we wordlessly decided to head toward the tents. Someone doused the fire. Dave helped me into our tent, while the others whispered outside, debating what to do. I could only catch bits of the conversation through the pounding in my skull. Sally had the smart idea of arranging the 3 tents in a U shape with the openings facing inward, so we'd all be close and only have one way in. Dave was about to go help, but I clung to his hand and asked him to stay. Eventually, everyone settled into their tents. A quick count confirmed there were 5 of us. Eric would be alone in his tent, but he seemed more relaxed knowing how close we all were now. I regret letting him sleep alone that night. He was always a bit of an outsider, and we should have known better. Right before we went to bed, we agreed to leave as soon as daylight broke. I took one last glance outside into the forest. The wind was picking up, and the trees swayed in rhythm. Beyond our little clearing was nothing but pure, impenetrable darkness. As I looked over at the 2 spare tents, I saw someone standing near them. Despite the fear, sleep came quickly. Ava's scream jolted me awake in the middle of the night. Dave and I scrambled out of our tent to see Sally and Ava standing at the entrance of Eric's tent. We pushed past them to look inside. Eric was still in his sleeping bag, but it was twisted and soaked with dark blood. His face was contorted in an expression of unbearable pain, and the rest of his body was rolled tightly around itself, as though something had crushed him. Dave zipped up the tent while Ava stood in shock, her eyes distant and unfocused. Sally shook her, tears streaming down her face, trying to get her to snap out of it. Dave grabbed a flashlight and shouted, "Get up! Run!" We bolted from the campsite, following the trail back to the car. Dave led the way with the flashlight, the beam barely lighting the path ahead. The thick canopy blocked out any moonlight, leaving us to navigate by the small circle of light. Ava stumbled, twisting her ankle. Someone tried to help her, but dragged her into the trees instead. It happened too fast. One moment she was with us, the next gone. Sally screamed and tried to run after her, but Dave held her back. She broke free and disappeared into the woods after Ava, her voice echoing Ava's name until it abruptly stopped. I was about to run after them when Dave grabbed my shoulders and shook me hard. "We have to go, Jenny, please." I hesitated but snapped into action when Sally's voice was cut off. We ran down the trail toward the car. There was nothing we could do now. At some point, there were 3 of us running, Dave, me, and someone behind us. "Dave, who's behind us?" I gasped. My lungs burned and my heart pounded painfully in my chest. Dave looked at me, confusion turning to terror, then rage. "Keep running," he ordered, pulling out a pocket knife and handing me the car keys. I almost dropped them. He turned on his heel and charged at whoever was following us. I kept running, tripping and falling down the trail. I didn't stop until I reached the end. When the trail opened into the familiar parking lot, I ran straight for the car, jumped in, and sped out onto the highway. I'm typing this from a rest stop. My phone finally has service and I've called 911, but I don't think they believe me. They're sending someone anyway. As I sit here waiting, the sun is finally rising. Before I post this, I should probably check why the person in the back seat hasn't said anything for the last hour. As the night progressed, the sense of dread grew, culminating in a terrifying revelation. What began as a simple camping trip ended in chaos and terror, leaving only a fragment of their once close-knit group. The unsettling truth of that night has left scars deeper than any physical wound. This story challenges our perceptions of reality and the very people we trust. Have you ever experienced something so inexplicable that it makes you question everything you thought you knew? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this eerie tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more chilling stories. Stay safe out there, and remember, sometimes the most unsettling things are those that go unseen.